Hello, everyone, and welcome to Comms in Question: Lessons from the Trade War. And I'm your host today, Lloyd Rang, with Curious Public, and I'm excited to have everyone join today. Just a couple of housekeeping things before we start. There will be an opportunity to ask questions in the chat. There are a number of questions that have been developed beforehand that we'll be asking panelists, but please feel free to have a conversation in the chat to ask questions, and if we can get to them, we will. And this is being recorded for posterity, and it will be available on our website following the completion of the webinar today. So welcome, everyone, on this wonderful day. And it's my great pleasure to introduce our panelists today. I'm going to start with someone who really needs no introduction, but I'm going to do it anyway. Kathleen Wynne is Ontario's 25th Premier, first woman, first openly gay person to hold the office. She led our province from 2013 to 2018. And during her time in government was champion of progressive policies and complex trade relationships, is certainly no stranger to these kinds of conversations. And Kathleen is continuing to be involved in public policy and as a speaker and an educator. And she's going to bring some great insights to this panel today. So welcome, Kathleen.
Thank you, Lloyd. Hi, everyone. Happy to be here.
Yeah, we're happy to have you. And our second guest today is no stranger to the spotlight, and certainly not the shy retiring type. Tim Hudak has a 21-year career as a member of provincial parliament, as a cabinet minister, leader of the Progressive Conservative Party of Canada, and now he is a partner at Counsel Public Affairs, where he continues to advise the Ontario government, including as a member of the Provincial Housing Affordability Task Force and chair of the Ontario Tourism Economic Recovery Task Force. And Tim has a lot of experience in how governments, businesses, and advocacy groups can communicate in a crisis. And I'm so glad that Tim is joining us today. Welcome, Tim.
Yeah, thanks, Lloyd. Great pleasure to be here on Curious Public. Premier Wynne, great to see you again. And Brian Topp, I'm looking forward to this.
Great to see you, Tim.
And our last guest is really famous as a fellow who gets stuff done behind the scenes. Brian Topp is a member of the Prime Minister's Council on Canada-U.S. relations. He's helping to steer Canada's response, but this is his first time in the trenches, of course. He's a veteran political strategist, former Chief of Staff to Premier Rachel Notley, and Deputy Chief of Staff to Premier Roy Romano. He's also a founding partner of GT and Company, and which is a leading public relations firm. He has spent decades at the intersection of policy, crisis, and communications, and I have had the privilege of working with him in the past, and he is wonderful. Welcome today, Brian.
Hi, Lloyd. Nice to see you. Tim and Kathleen, what fun we're going to have today talking about just a small matter, that's on everyone's minds.
It's going to be a fun one. So I'm going to start with a question for all of you. We'll just sort of do this round robin style, and then I'll have a couple that I'll direct to you, but to each. But so what do you think the communications objectives have been during this trade dispute for both sides, and who's winning the argument right now, in your opinion? And I'll just let you weigh in.
Well, I think that the objective, so we're talking about the U.S. and Canada, and those are the players, because there are others who are having a conversation with the United States as well. But I think for our purposes, we're talking about ourselves and the U.S. And I think that the objective of the U.S. is to assert power, to assert their might, or his. I would say this is the president. I don't think it's the people of the United States. I think it's the president. And to create instability, I think the creation of instability in order to take advantage of that instability that's created in the other nations, particularly Canada and Mexico, if we're looking at North America. And I think the Canadian objective has been to demonstrate that we are not going to back down. I think that all of the leaders, all of the interlocutors with officials in the States have been trying to assert that in one way or another. And then I think the message at home is that we have options and that we have the ability to retaliate, because that message is important to the people of the country. I'm not going to weigh into who's winning right now. It feels to me like we're engaged, and I think it's a toss-up right now who's going to win the air war, let alone the real substantive trade conflict.
Brian and Tim, any thoughts?
Go ahead, Tim.
So yeah, I think President Trump's objectives are very clear. It's to repatriate well-paying middle-class jobs, particularly in the states that he turned from blue to red in the last campaign. I think behind the scenes a little bit, it is to get more revenue. There's the folks know President Trump's margin in the House of Representatives is very narrow. He needs a group of Republicans called the Freedom Caucus to back his agenda to get big things done. They want to cut spending towards balancing a budget, and President Trump is going to need revenue to support tax cuts and to get a better revenue picture. So tariffs drive that as well. And honest to God, I think part of it at the beginning was it isn't like Trudeau. So a couple of cheap shots there against our prime minister definitely motivated the president. Canadian side, okay, so number one, survive, right? Like we did not expect this extent of the attention. So get on your feet, fight back for Canadian jobs. And then as part of this, Premier Ford's motivation to win a third consecutive election and defend jobs in our province and country. And I think for Mark Carney and for Pierre Poilievre, it's to win the next federal election. And then from a seat in government, defend Canada. Happy to wade in too, Lloyd. I'll pause there. Happy to wade in through my gold, silver, and medal winners to date.
What do you think, Brian?
So I think Canada's trying to talk to three audiences. So first of all, it's trying to talk to the Canadian domestic audience. And in the first instance, what Canada needed to do was have us look like a less easy mark. And that meant that we had to stop looking like a herd of cats who, when they were confronted with this threat, they ran in all directions, tried to figure out how to guess what was in Mr. Trump's head and offer it to him in advance so that he would stop doing these bad things. And instead, the country needed to be called together. It needed to understand that it was that you couldn't in advance head this off, that we were going to be in a long conflict with the United States of America, which is a shocking thing to say, and that we needed to stand together as a team. And full credit to outgoing Prime Minister Trudeau for doing this. He had an excellent moment in his last weeks as Prime Minister of Canada, and he achieved his goal, I think, which is that, with the notable exception of the Premier of Alberta, that he basically succeeded in bringing together Canada's leaders and the population together on a common effort. Second audience that we're trying to talk to is the United States of America. And basically what we're trying to say to the United States of America is what you're doing here will hurt you. That at the end of the day, the measures that you're proposing will be harmful for your own economy.
Well, this is kind of jumping in a little bit to the question. Oh, sure.
And then finally, we're trying to talk to allies. And the ally, we're trying to say, you're going to be picked off one by one, so stand together. Look, is that working? You know, broadly speaking, it is working. And Tim has got it on what the Americans are trying to do. Trump is trying to look strong to his population overall, and he's particularly talking to swing states and saying he cares about it. The problem he's got is that they are doing so much all at once that I don't think the American public are hearing much of it. I think awareness on this issue is low. Sorry, back to you, Lloyd.
No, yeah, sorry, and I didn't mean to jump into you, but you said something I was trying to grab, which is, you've worked with a lot of leaders over the years, and behind the scenes. Who do you, and you touched on this a bit in your answer, but who do you see who's been effective for Canada? Who's been an effective spokesperson for the U.S. and what's made them effective in so doing, do you think?
Look, I'm going to keep throwing a few flowers to Mr. Trudeau. It's, and I think my colleagues on this panel will agree with this, that you're never more popular than when you start and your last day.
and until you die, then you're really popular, but I'm not ready for that stuff yet.
Yeah, this the flowers you get in the house. He was fine. He was a gentleman. We all loved him, provided that he's really dead. But in any event, look, Prime Minister Trudeau did a really good job as our national prime minister, and he stuck all the right notes in his public statements, and also his inside game was really good. So they did what they had to do, which starts with bringing the Canadian premiers together to get them to stop undermining the country and to work together as a team. And with one notable exception, he achieved that, and so he deserves our gratitude for pulling this off. And it's early days for our current prime minister. We're going to have to see whether he is our prime minister in an election. But the key thing he said which is we're not going to negotiate with the United States until they stop threatening our sovereignty and our independence. And the discussion that we need to have goes well beyond a reopener of COSMA and into a discussion about this relationship, because what the United States has done here is flout trade agreements that this president himself signed. That was pretty good, strong opening position. And so I think, Canada's being pretty well served by its prime ministers in a really, really dangerous threat. With regard to the United States, as I said, I think the Trump administration is acting so chaotically on so many fronts that I'd be willing to bet that Americans are not hearing a lot of what the United States has to say on this issue. But I do think that, as we were discussing a second ago, that the president is getting across to his base that he's strong, and that's what the core of his strength is, to those people. Strong. Let's be strong again. Let's stop being weak. Let's stop being played as patsies, even if it means flouting agreements that you yourself have signed. And I do think that his message that he is aiming to reshore key American industries into swing states is starting to be heard there. So, for example, United Auto Workers have backed the president in what he's doing here, and that's exactly what he's after. He's after working class people in swing states feeling that he's backing them.
Any thoughts, Tim and Kathleen, on any of that?
I give my gold, silver, and bronze. Back that up. Look, I think Premier Ford has been the only one who has successfully spoken through Americans to Canadians and spoken to Americans. So he was successful in his campaign, not so because he was sort of beating his chest of being a Canadian nationalist. He actually had the right tone in communicating to Americans across all the major networks, throughout the media, that got communicated back home, in a successful re-election since. But he seems to be the only one so far that gets it, Lloyd, that you need to motivate American decision makers, and hopefully through public opinion in their districts, to change, to make a deal with Canada and point the trade guns at the U.S. So he's my gold medal winner. I'm going to go off the board here. My silver medal winner is Flavio Volpe. I think Flavio has been incredible, leading of the auto parts manufacturers, and similarly, using the art of communication, keeping your message simple, understanding who your audience is, and telling stories that average folks can understand. He similarly is communicating to Americans to try to move opinion there and get good outcomes from Canada. And cue the Darth Vader music. My bronze is actually President Trump. Now, what Canadians think doesn't really matter that much to him. I guess some goodwill is wasted. But to Brian's point, he's reinforcing a key campaign theme. At the end of the day, he's going to get something, right? I mean, President Trump, you can't take him literally, but you need to take him seriously. I just hope the deal at the end of the day, and we'll probably get to this later, Lloyd, in the conversation, will be as beneficial to Canadians as it will be to Americans.
Yeah, I'd agree with what Tim has said. I think that Doug Ford, he stepped into a vacuum in terms of some, the change happening at the federal level. But I do think that there was, I'm just reading between the lines, but I think there was a good conversation going on between the officials at the provincial in Ontario and the federal level, and I think across the country, so that, as you've said, Brian, with one notable exception, there has been a coordination of message, and that's what I think is key. And I know, Lloyd, this goes into a question that I know you want to ask, but I think the most important thing that we can do right now as Canadians, the Canadian leaders, is to coordinate that message, coordinate a strategy, and try to find a way to bring that notable exception in. I think it's very, very very problematic for us to be seen as fractured in our message and in our leadership. And so my hope for the immediate and the midterm is that we get that coordination back, and that there is a strong message. And sometimes the coordinated strategy can look like the premiers putting forward proposals and the federal government either backing them up or having a different conversation. There can be a good cop, bad cop that can happen, but there has to be a strategy, and there has to be a relentless communication between the provincial and the federal level. So that for me will build on the success that we've had so far, if we can say success. I think it's interesting, Tim, you've given out the awards, but in terms of who's winning the trade war, I don't think you're saying anyone has won yet. You're just saying who's broken through at this point, because we're right at the beginning of this, folks. It's going to be a long 4 years.
Well, and I really appreciate, Kathleen, the point about the coordination between the players in Canada. Anyway, it does seem to be a team approach, and it does seem to be a lot of it seems to me that Premier Ford, is acting together with his partners in the federal government and other provinces as well. I'll throw a couple other names out that I think have been impressive to Canadians. I think Melanie Joly is surprisingly, as a kind of a minor minister earlier in her career, has really stepped up, and she's been on U.S. networks and has received some accolades. Wab Kinew, I think, has been amazing, an amazingly calming voice. I'll throw out another one, Charlie Angus, very different energy than Wab, but like very, very much out there. I think it's really interesting to see, to my mind anyway, and the last point I'll make before next question is, it's interesting to see the growth in certain people through crisis. Crisis reveals kind of who you are, reveals character, and it's interesting to see and Tim, you mentioned Flav. Like, Flav's a great communicator. Really it's great to see some of these people standing up and learning and on the job and really tapping into their strengths, which I think is really important. So for Kathleen,
Lloyd, can I just jump in? Because Flavio Volpe, so when I was premier in 2016 and Trump was first elected, Flavio was absolutely critical. I was already engaged in conversations with governors and members of Congress, but Flavio was critical in terms of bringing the industry together. And I think, to Tim's point, that is why he's been able to step up so quickly and forcefully, because he had such a strong foundation and he's so well respected. When he talks about the auto supply chain, people know that he knows exactly what he's talking about. Mm-hmm. So there were a couple of moments just after Trump was reelected where there really weren't any voices coming from Canada at all, and Flavio was one person whose voice we did hear. So I think that he's been a force for cohesion for years on this file.
And I think it goes to a tactic of just having your subject matter experts be prepared to speak. And he is definitely a deep subject matter expert in the auto industry. If you were advising the Canadian team, Kathleen, what would you advise them to do differently? Or is there anything that you would say, hey, more of this, less of that? Any thoughts on your part?
Well, I think what I've said about coordination is the most important thing. I said on another podcast that Tim and I were on that I thought it might be a good idea for Doug Ford, as the head of the Council of the Federation, to go out and have a tete-a-tete with Danielle Smith. I think that there's a real need for Alberta to visibly be brought in, to be a sort of supporting of Alberta. I think it's important. And she's gone way off the chart in terms of what's okay at this point. So I think that needs to happen. And then I think the second thing is that that coordination that I talked about, not that there would be an explicit laying out of the strategy, but I think once we're through this federal election, and maybe it has to happen before, but certainly when we're through the federal election and the new government is in place, there needs to be an explicit visibility to the coordination for the people in the country to see. I think people need to feel confident that there is that coordination, that everyone is speaking with one voice, and that becomes not just a comfort. And the work that Charlie Angus is doing right now, I saw him the other night at one of the Elbows Up meetings, and he said, this is what I do now. He's going around and he's rallying people, and that's great. That's kind of a foundation of energy and enthusiasm to build on. But then the government needs to really be explicit about that coordination. And I think there are ways of doing that. I think people seeing the premiers and the prime minister meeting together, we saw that. But before the election, it didn't carry as much weight as it will after the election, because that's the team that will be actually taking the message to the United States. So I think that coordination, that visibility is really important, and that's how I advise them to move forward right now.
Brian?
It's just another point on this. So the premiers have been meeting weekly for the most part. And one of the things that we have going for us here is that they started to work together like that during COVID. And so basically the kind of the battle approach they developed together, and it is sort of, you almost have to pinch yourself and go, our system of government works, really? And yet, you know, there it does, with one big exception that I have to tell you, I fear is not going to change. But just one more point. No country survives a conflict in another country, and that's what we're in here. We're in an economic and a threat to our independence, possibly against the United States of America. That's how much the world has changed. No country survives a conflict like that if you can't tell your story to yourself. So in addition to our leaders getting their act together, let me put this as nicely as I can. Blowing up our public broadcaster would be bonkers. This is a time when you need to have a village square for the country in which Canadians know where they can go to find out what's going on with the properly professional journalists, and that there's a village square where people are talking. And maybe we're going to rediscover the value of Canadian voices in our media, in which they talk about not just what's happened today and the latest craziness from the United States, but our shared values and our history and what we're all about. So to remember why we're doing this, because people are going to be called to sacrifice in this fight. People are going to lose their jobs. There's going to be a big economic dislocation. And as Kathleen said, this is going to go on for years. And so on communications, there's a requirement not just for our leadership to have its act together, but that we have the right tools to wage this discussion, which includes a place for Canadians to come together to know what's going on.
I'm gonna tap into that in a second, because that's a good point, Brian. Tim, any thoughts on that? What advice you'd give? Question.
Yeah, I have two, and I'm going to relate it back to the earlier point about, you gave me a list, Lloyd, gave us a list of who you think's doing all right. Yeah, okay. They're playing, elbows up, or in hockey analogies, they're playing OHL right now. I think only Ford and Flavio are playing at the pro level, and Canadian Americans as opposed to Canadians. So let me tell you one more thing too about why Ford gets the gold medal. He's the only guy that landed a punch, right? He's the only guy that actually landed a punch that got the president's attention. And there's two theories here, Lloyd, right? What do you do when you confront a bully? You get bullied, you can stand up to him. There is an alternative that we'll put on the table. You could pick on somebody smaller. So we could sail our Navy to Greenland, Panama, as an alternative. But if my colleagues aren't even laughing, so they didn't bite on that one at all. The fact that the premier went to the threat of attacks on electricity, and then caused President Trump then to finally take notice that there's some pain on both sides here. Have we not noticed a recent detente? We've had, no more explosions on this file. Meetings are taking place. So the premier is the only one that actually stood up and cut through all of this mess. And to the, the other point in terms of, communicating as a country, for sure, for sure. And the appeal to Canadian nationalism has been quite strong. But I do want to say that the key here is to motivate Americans and capture their attention to try to get to a better deal at the end of the day. And I think that's possible. I remain an optimist.
Yeah.
Lloyd, I just need to say, because I think there's something else going on and none of us has mentioned it. I do believe that whatever work is being done by the Flavio Volpes, the Doug Fords, the internal United States actors, there is pain that's already being perceived in the States, right? There are businesses that are already hurting. The stock market, goes up and down, but people are very nervous. So I do think, to the detente point, Tim, I do think that part of our relentless strategy has to be to continue to work those relationships so that there's an understanding on the part of leadership in each of the states how interconnected we are, and make the link between what Trump is doing and what the pain that's being felt in those jurisdictions. We cannot let up on that. That message has to be on the part of our officials and our leaders. That has to continue on a daily basis. As Brian said, the premiers are meeting weekly. There's a conversation that has to go on every day with our representative in Washington, with all of the people who are making decisions and who are advising the president.
But let's not.
I don't know if you guys. I don't know if you guys saw, but the Canadian government launched billboards in some of the red states yesterday that says, you know, tariffs are a tax on your groceries. Just very simple messaging, very clear, unmistakable. So that's a way to reach American consumers and turn things as well. What I want to go to you now, Tim, for a question, because we talked about the role of, you know, traditional media, and Brian was talking about the role of the CBC in unifying Canadians. And then there's this whole conversation going on in social media, which is really amplifying the discussion. You see Canadians and Americans in places like Threads and Twitter, other places, having these conversations. Is that helpful? Is it helpful for ordinary Canadians to wade in, have a point of view, express themselves online? Or is social media just a dumpster fire and we should just avoid it completely? Like, what do you think?
Yes, social media is a dumpster fire. You know, I was first politician in Canada had his own app. It was so cool, right? You could see where I go. You could read my speeches. You get my barbecue recipes, Lloyd. It was a lot of fun. It's been all downhill since they're on the dumpster fire. But look, you know, you got to vent. I think that's a natural human behavior to get that out there. So for the average person, totally get it. You want information too. This is a fast-moving dynamic that could impact your job, the price of groceries, your daughter, son's, you know, future. So that's natural. Here's why it's important. I think it's very important for businesses to help, first of all, defend territory. I've lost track. Can I buy Heights? French's? Like, what's the ketchup I get from, you know, from Loblaws, right? So making sure that people understand what's a Canadian product, it's not, if you're worried about getting labeled as an American product. Secondly, I think it's important for businesses to tell their story in easily understandable terms about what's at stake when it comes to jobs and investment. Most importantly, whether this is for Canadians, for business leaders, and all of us, is to reach out to Americans and help to tell the story on a trade war making things more expensive and costing all of us jobs. I think the tone should be more in sadness than in anger. But there's a risk that we go too far. I worry that Olivia Chow is relishing a little too much in this. I think Scott Moe blew it when he banned Bud Light that happened to be brewed in Saskatchewan and in Canada. So you got to be careful, Lloyd, that you don't cross the line and cause longer term damage.
Any thoughts, Kathleen, on that?
No, I think that's absolutely fair. I think that it's a tool. It can be used, you know, to inform people. But you know, to the extent that the dumpster fire takes over, then that's a problem, right?
Yeah. There's certainly a lot of anger online. Like, I mean, there's certainly a lot of Canadians who are just sort of wading into, you know, whether it's trolls or bots or actual Americans, are wading into conversations and trying to set the record straight. I wonder how helpful that is. That's an
But
open
it's a
question.
reality. I mean,
Yeah.
it exists. We're not going to be able to, and right now we're not going to be able to get rid of it, deal with it. It's there. I think there has to be a counterbalance in terms of other things that are being done. Where are the, you know, Brian talked about the town square. Where's the place where people can come together and have a conversation that isn't a dumpster fire, that isn't
Yeah.
just a shooting match? You know, how do we actually find some support from one another? And you know, COVID did us a huge disservice in terms of those kinds of interactions. And so maybe this is an opportunity to recreate that. It won't be the same, but a way of coming together and supporting one another.
The debates between trolls is just noise. But digital is where people go to find out what's going on. And the business of, I want to know what's happening right now, so I go click and I find out what's going on. We just need to be sure that we're there and that people know where to find our side of the story. And let's also remember that after the people read, when things are breaking and they're big, that then people want to look at the picture. So they go to television news and they watch people and they listen with their eyes. They look at their people talking. And so when you're interested in communications, here, Lloyd, you know, the two key tools are make sure that when you want to know it, that you can find it and that it's easy to get to and that you can get authoritative information quickly and easily. And then people want to see the video. And so we have to think on the video side of things and be always, you know, in a world where our competitor is the largest communications machine that has ever been seen in human history, that we have our side of the story on video where people want to see it.
So Kathleen, you sat in the big chair as a leader. What goes through your mind in a moment of crisis like this? What are you trying to communicate? What's keeping you up at night? What are you worried about in a situation like this?
Well, just to be, to be fair, I've never been in a chair when a crisis of this proportion was actually upon us. I mean, I was there in 2016, and but I think 2016 was a paler version of this. I don't think we were dealing with the same issues. Um, when you ask me that question, what comes to mind is a much smaller event, but it was the ice storm in 2013 when I had just become the leader, and I was the premier at that point. And the first thing that was in my mind was, who is hurting? Who's at risk? How do we help the people who are at risk? I was worried, for example, about people who were at the top of apartment buildings, and seniors, people who couldn't get down, people who couldn't get food. Those were the questions that I was asking the officials. How can we make sure there are support systems, that people are being reached out to, and that they are getting the support they need? So I think that the first job is to make sure that we know who's in pain. And I think in this crisis, who's losing their jobs? Who are the people who are not going to be able to put food on the table for their children and their families? And how do we, as a society, react to that? How do we respond? How do we make sure that that people have what they need? And I think you can see that in the you can see it in the federal election campaign already. There's a conversation that has begun about, what would you do as a leader to make sure that people are taken care of if they're displaced? So that's the first thing, Lloyd. Who's most at risk, physically, emotionally, mentally? Who's in trouble? And then the next piece is, how do we do a good job of reassuring people? And this goes to what I said earlier about the visibility of having a strategy. We've got this, we know what we're doing, we have a plan. Yes, there's a role for you to play, people in the public, but taking a leadership role and demonstrating that there is a plan. And I think during the pandemic, when you saw leaders at the provincial and the federal level going out every day at the microphone talking about what was happening. I'm not suggesting that has to happen every single day, but there does need to be a visible plan that can help reassure people. And, the social media, to Brian's point about people getting information so people know what's happening. And then the final thing is the working on the relationships. So who is it who knows how to deal with these relationships? Who do I turn to make sure that I'm getting the best information? So when Trump was first elected, we had a representative in Washington, Monique Smith, who was on the ground. She knew when the tariffs were being put on, or the Buy America stuff was going on in New York. She went to Albany. She was talking to the representatives. She had the relationships. So that's the third thing. Who's got the relationships that I can rely on to give me the information I need about what we should do next?
Yeah, well, that's great. That amazing answer. Thank you so much for that. Any thoughts, Brian or Tim?
I think any Canadian leader looking at this matter needs to tell themselves this: there's no free trade party in the United States anymore. So both the Democrats and the Republicans have abandoned this model. They both are making commitments to the people of America that they're going to reshore the key industries. The Americans are taking dead aim at the heart of the Ontario economy here, saying that there's going to be no cars sold in the United States that are not made in the United States. There's going to be no steel bought in the United States that isn't made in the United States. No pharmaceuticals that are used in the United States will be made there. And so I think that's not going to change. You're not going to get back to the way things were before, because there's no political party that wants the way they were before. And that means that we have to do something that we've never done before, which is we actually have to be a value-added economy with the trades to the world, and not just with one counterparty, first Britain and then the United States. And that's a big, big challenge, which is why this matter is not going away in a negotiation in the next little while. It's going to be, and the leaders, both provincial and the federal leaders, are going to have to wrestle with this gigantic issue that is about Canada. Is going to fundamentally change. Really, for the first time since we've become a country, we're going to stop being a raw material supplier to one metropolitan economy, and we're going to have to become something a lot better than that.
I'm of a certain age here. I remember the debate between Mulrooney and Turner about this back in the day. So are you saying Turner was right, Brian?
Look, I think that's debatable. There's no question that there was a free trade moment that produced a lot of prosperity. It also produced a lot of grotesque inequality all around the world that was allowed to run. All I'm really saying is whatever you think about whether Turner was right or Mulroney was right, that things are now really different. And the key was there used to be a counterparty in the United States that wanted this model, and now there is no counterparty in the United States that wants it. What Trump is doing here, that what he's selling to those swing states is a lift from Bernie Sanders and the heart of the Democratic Party and from the U.S. labor movement, who have been saying what Trump has been saying for years, which is that the United States is being taken for patsies, and they're talking about China and the massive transfer of manufacturing jobs from the United States to Asia. But my point is, a list of things that we promised not to do in return for tariff-free access to the United States and a dispute settlement mechanism that they will respect, I'm not sure that's coming back. And so if it's not coming back, and everybody has been saying this, and we've been saying it for 150 years, is we have to move up the value chain and have more than one trade partner. And now we really have to do it because we're going to be forced to do it.
So on the leadership side, I'm more of an optimist than Brian is, and I'm happy to talk about that, momentarily if you like, Lloyd. But to the Premier's point, no precedent. Closest thing I had was at 9/11, and I was Tourism, Culture, Recreation Minister at that time. So what's leadership in a crisis? You have to motivate your team. You have to display confidence. You have to have some vision of the better place and outline how you get there. You can never see them sweat or look down. You're inspiring in this, not just your teammates, but an entire country. Then I think what you're working on in the back room, what are the trade-offs going to be, Lloyd? And I think it's going to be around Canada, once again, pulling our weight when it comes to defense in North America. We boxed way above our weights in World War II, World War I, Korea. Since then, we're at the back of the pack with Slovenia, for Christ's sake, and when it comes to our defense. So do we really want to be there? And are there trade-offs when it comes to the Americans as well, around some of the protections we have on telecommunications, around agriculture, around transportation, airlines, that could, I hope, ultimately lower costs and create more jobs here in Canada?
It's interesting as you folks are talking, I just reminded of how long a conversation this is. Like not between us, but I mean in Canada and in North America, right? Like, the roots of this go back to the end of the Second World War. They proceed through the 60s and 70s and 80s into free trade discussions and liberalization, WTO in the 90s. Like there's all kinds of like twists and turns in this. If you look at it as a story, it's a very long story with lots of different components to it, and we could spend hours talking about that story. I wonder, thinking about this, Brian, this is one for you about trust. Because you mentioned you think this has sort of changed the board a bit, but I want to go to the issue of trust, which is something that companies need to invest in, that governments invest in, and that people ultimately feel, I think, in their gut. Do you think trust is gone? And is there anything in Canadians and Americans, and maybe in Americans and Canadians even? And do you think that there's anything that can be done to restore that trusting relationship? What would need to be said or done, do you think?
I don't think that the kind of trust that not just Canada, but the Western world had in their partnerships with the United States is reparable. I think I think we have all been taught a bitter lesson here about being over dependent on one power. And I don't think that people are ever going to say again that that you can take to the bank that the United States will always be there for you. What we learned here is that the United States will reverse its defense, intelligence, and economic relationships on the flip of a dime in 6 weeks if a couple of 100,000 people in swing states are unhappy about the price of eggs. And that's a learning that cannot be unlearned. And so that's why, for example, the European community is looking at creating its own defense production alliance and at disentangling from American defense technology and standing on their own feet, and why I think it would be very wise for Canada to join such an association. Because I think the overdependence and over-faith in the United States has been proved to be unwise, and that's not going to change. And there are permanent changes to our trade relationships that are occurring now too.
Can I jump in, Lloyd, on
Yeah,
that?
please, yeah.
I think that's true. It's interesting. I was asked by a group of students at U of T just this week, did I think that after, after the next American election, or once we get through this with Trump, will we go back? And I said pretty much what Brian said, that I think that there's something that has been broken in terms of that trust relationship. Now, I don't know that I agree with you, Brian, that the United States is actually, I think that it may be Trump's mission, but it can go to as isolationist a place as you are suggesting. I mean, I think that may be the objective, but I think I believe that, that story that Lloyd was talking about, it really starts hundreds of years ago. Like it's not a 100-year-old story. It's much older than that. And so that relationship, because of our geography, is not going to go away. We're going to have to work out some kind of mutuality. But has there been something broken? I was telling these young kids in 1963 when JFK was shot. I was in grade 6. I remember sitting at my desk. The school shut down because we were all weeping, because we felt so emotionally bound to the Americans. And I'm not sure that is going to come back, but it's certainly not going to come back in the immediate future. And that was the bond that the trust was built on. And so I do think we have to understand that, but I'm not sure that between the people that trust is gone. I think that there are individuals, obviously, and Tim, from your experience in Niagara, I mean, there are families on each side of the border who are closely related to one another. They're best friends. They spend time together. So those trust relationships are going to be really critical in the go forward, I think.
I'll add quickly to that. Lloyd, is that all right?
Yeah, please.
Kramer made a great point there, right? I that's why I'm on the optimist side of this particular coin. The cultural bonds, the economic bonds, I just think are so strong that the relationship is bruised, but it ain't broken. And when I had the chance to go on behalf of Council of Public Affairs and join the Premier's group in Washington D.C., and there was a lot of sympathy for the Canadian cops, right? They say, yeah, we don't quite know what the president's up to, but we don't agree with it. We should turn our trade guns on China, not on Canada. And they understood that the impact would be negative on both sides of the border. The catch was they didn't want to be primaried. Like, I'm just not going to say anything yet, but I'm with you. I think that will eventually change because of those bonds when it comes to the economy and when it comes to the cultural relationships as well.
Well, I think one little example. Does it make sense forevermore to send 98% of our energy exports to one market, given what we have learned here?
But we can't get out of the country.
I bet the answer
right?
No.
It's landlocked.
I know. Believe me, I know all about that. But my point is, when I'm saying that things are going to change, does it make sense to send 98% of our energy exports to one market when, in consequence, they use their monopoly position to discount a product? The answer is obviously not. And so, with what you were just saying about the infrastructure challenges that we have, obviously that has to change. Okay, and that's what I mean by things are going to change. That this unidimensional single client approach that we have in all of our key commodities markets has to change. That's the lesson we've learned.
I think that's a really interesting point, because it's not going to change overnight, and for something like that energy trade to change, to pivot, it's going to take a tremendous amount of infrastructure building, like so much hard work behind the scenes to pivot that relationship. It's going to be really, really hard. One thing I wanted to pick up what you said, Tim, I'm a Niagara guy too, by the way, is that 90% of Americans and 90% of Canadians agree on the same thing, which is not, like, no one really wants this 51st state nonsense.
No.
So the numbers are pretty much the same on both sides of the border, really. And so it's interesting that regular people are like, what the heck are we talking about here? As opposed, and so all of this conversation seems to be happening at one level where, it's at the sort of street level, people are kind of perplexed by it, I think. Question for you, Tim. You've worked with a lot of Canadian businesses, especially the housing industry, for example. What's the role of a private company in a time like this? Do they, they have an obligation to speak up on behalf of their market? Do they have an obligation to speak to their markets in other countries? Like what are I think of Chapman's yogurt. I mean, I think that's, or ice cream rather. They've done a really good job of sort of wrapping themselves in the flag, and they're an amazing company in terms of supporting their workers and everything else. But are there other industries where you think that they might have a slightly different role to play?
Yeah, okay, great question, Lloyd. So I think there's three things that the business leaders can do, and then I'll come back to the latter part of your question about a specific sector. Number one, I'll reinforce, tell your story. You have an obligation to fight for the women and men on your payroll that are depending upon you to put food on the table, get the kids off to college. So tell your story in language that people will understand, about the impact on jobs, the local economy. Step two, get allies on the American side of the border. To his credit, our trade representative, David Patterson, I think has done an outstanding job of driving this point home in the U.S. Counsel was great. It was really enjoyed working with him to achieve that purpose for some of our clients. So communicate to the Americans to then bubble up to the American elected individuals on the damage on the American side of the border. Third, support sensible solutions, not some of the garbage that we've seen in an overreaction to jump on the bandwagon of anti-Americanism. Let me give you an example of that. The notion that we would ban companies who happen to have an American headquarters but employ Canadians, long-standing investments in communities, supporting Canadian charities, we're going to disqualify them from competing for contracts. I think that's a bunch of nonsense and harmful and terribly short-sighted. I think Olivia Chow's view to ban Uber and Lyft is not about being anti-American. It's to reward 1970s anachronism, big taxi, as opposed to being a central policy where hundreds of people depend on those jobs and thousands as drivers right here in Canada. An opposite side of the coin, I think, to where Brian was a little bit. Yeah, you had to be realistic about this. So ignoring the American base. Mark Carney was out today saying we need to build more Canadian cars exclusively, all in. Probably sounds good and be good during an election campaign, but we actually export 85% of our automobiles to the United States. We build them simply for Canadians. It's not much of a market, it'd be a huge shrinkage of jobs. And we depend on employees on both sides of the border. So I think, again, reinforcing, telling the story, working with agencies to make sure you're there on designs for any assistance program, communicating with Americans, and then calling out the bad policy to focus on the good.
So I'm going to pick up on that a little bit, and then I'm going to rapid fire it around. I'm going to start with Kathleen. But then, so if you're a company leader right now, what's the message that you're sending to people inside your company then? Like, what are you telling people internally, starting with you, Kathleen?
Well, you're telling them what you're doing to preserve their jobs. I mean, I think that's the question that people in companies have got right now. Like, where are we going to be working? Are we going to be working? And how long are we going to be working? I mean, we've got, I've got family who work in the auto industry, and we're waiting to hear if lines are going to shut down. So I think young people who are counting on a career in a particular industry, they need to know what's coming at them.
Yeah. Any thoughts, Brian and Tim?
Yeah, I think first of all, you need to tell people what's going on. It's back to the point of it. People need reliable information and a cacophony of noise. And so every employer needs to invest, I think, in telling their employees what's going on in this trade dispute, what's going on in our industry, and what's going on with our company. And then I think you need to be, as informative as is reasonable in explaining what you're going to do about it. And what you're going to do about it for many Canadian industries is talking to the government of Canada about where they fit into the countervail, the rounds of countervail that are coming. So that the industry needs to be talking to the government of Canada and let people know what is happening on that. And secondly, describe the advocacy efforts that you're making in the United States to try to dissuade them from this act of self-harm that they're engaged in.
Tim, any thoughts? What would you tell the people that were? Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Kathleen.
Yeah. So
go, Tim. I want to hear what Tim has to say. Yeah.
Okay. Thanks. So I gave my 3 points that I think I'd recommend to businesses. Brian brought up retaliatory tariffs. Make sure you're in on the design of programs, not trying to get in the door after they've been built. If you can't do it, work with firms like ours to get that done, or Brian's. Okay. So here's the part I left out, my part B. Housing has an opportunity here. It is one of our major sectors in Canada. It is not an export industry. Sure, they'll be impacted by this, but I think this is a moment, Lloyd, for housing to shine, to say we can be the buoy to keep people's heads above water during the current trade disputes, to actually, waive development charges, get more homes built, help people who are, vulnerable to being on the streets into homes, bring more modular. I think housing can actually help stabilize in this really rough roller coaster we're on right now.
I just wanted to, and I agree with that, sort of a Marshall Plan for housing. I think that is a good idea. But I also wanted to say, when Tim was talking about things that we can do and being realistic, unenforceable policy is bad policy, So to suggest that we're going to ban Uber, for example, like people are not going to understand that. They're not going to put up with it. I mean, the Uber drivers are Canadians who need that work, and nobody's going to buy that is a reasonable thing to do. So I think leaders have to be careful that they put in place policies that are understandable. Yes, they need to be symbolic. They need to have a symbolic weight to them. But if everything that we suggest is unenforceable, then it just becomes nonsense, and nobody believes that we're doing anything.
One of the conversations we have internally is about, as a Curious Public team, is like, okay, so what's our market now? What are we looking at? What are the opportunities for us? How can we pivot? How can we change? Is there some sort of way that so part of it is just analysis, kind of ongoing internally too, to talk about, okay, so what does this moment mean for us and where can we go? And the irony is, of course, there's American companies that are approaching us now saying, how the heck do we talk to Canadians right now? Like you guys are so mad at us, how are we going to have a conversation with you about our product, the thing that we're trying to sell to you? And in this, like, what do we say in this moment? It's like, well, there's actually an opportunity there to do some cansplaining to Americans too, right? To say, hey, here's how we're feeling right now.
But
and here's what we need you to be saying to your president.
Yeah.
Like, I think there needs to be an honest conversation, corporate leader to corporate leader. Like, what are you saying to those decision makers?
Mm-hmm. And here we see forgive me for continuing my dark theme, the elements of the sinister in this American administration, because they're intimidating their own people and trying to silence them.
Yes.
And people who speak up the way they did in the last round are being threatened with retribution, which is the key theme of this administration in this first few weeks. But look, American companies operating in Canada face a very tough situation. There's no doubt about it. Things are hot, and look, I think they're going to get hotter. So what do you do? Kind of as we just heard, I think the best thing that Americans can do when they're operating in this market is to talk about their Canadian employees and talk about the contribution that they're making to the economy, and to say, when this is over, we're still going to be neighbors and friends. We're going to need to work together, and we're going to try to do the best we can here. But I just think it's a big ask of American companies to take on the Trump administration right now, because the Trump administration is not a normal government. They're not conducting themselves normally, and a big piece of what they're doing is working to silence their opponents. We need to understand that when we tell ourselves that this time we will be saved by Americans speaking up for us. I'm not sure that's going to happen.
A very different response, Costco versus Anheuser-Busch, for example, right? So Anheuser-Busch just kind of gave up on LGBTQ causes and completely vacated the field, whereas Costco was kind of pushing back on the anti-DEI stuff for a while there in the US. And so it's interesting to watch corporate players in the US take various positions, vis-a-vis the administration as well. And some are willing to stick their neck out and others are not. I know on calls that I've had with American clients and American companies or businesses that do the same sort of work that Curious Public does, they're at a bit of a loss as to what they do with, for example, their DEI programs. Like, do we rebrand them? Do we get rid of them entirely? What do we, are we going to be penalized? You've got the governor of Maine fighting with the president right now over funding for universities. So it's an interesting time, certainly from a communications perspective, of how far above the parapet do you want to stick your neck, right? So
I just hope, Brian, I actually would have thought you would make this argument given where you live on the political spectrum. But if there's one corporation standing up and saying that, then obviously they're at risk. But the more of those big guys, because they're guys, a lot of them, the more of them who say to Trump and to his leadership, this is not okay. I think silence is the enemy here, right? And so at some point, there's going to have to be some kind of collective voice that says, this is not good for us. I think it's very quiet. It's a quiet voice right now. I agree with Brian. And it's not going to work. It's not going to work as quickly as it did in the first Trump administration. But at some point, my goodness, the corporations who will see their businesses at risk and will see what it's doing to their communities have got to step up and speak for them. I mean, maybe I'm living in the past in terms of my understanding of the American spirit, but I really believe at some point that's going to have to happen. Don't you think, Brian?
I wish I did. I well remember when I was on the advisory council for the last round, and there were many allies to the United States then. But I just, given that this is not a normal administration, I'm concerned. Let me put it this way. Yes, there's the only answer to people like this is to pool your efforts and answer. Right. The 30s teach us that.
Exactly.
But I don't think that when the pushback comes, as inevitably will, that I don't think the first movers this time are going to be Americans. I think what has to happen is that because this administration is making the mistake of threatening everybody simultaneously, that everybody needs to pool their effort.
Right.
And when the American business community and the American people see that the United States is setting itself up to not have a friend in the world here, and that it is undermining all its alliances simultaneously, and that every democracy in the world is starting to pool their efforts to deal with the United States, then there may be saner voices that will think about it. But I also, as I hate to say it, but I don't think we should kid ourselves. There are no free traders in the United States anymore.
That is true. Yeah.
So we got to end there because we're at overtime. We could talk all day probably. And thanks so much, each of you, for joining us. Tim, Kathleen, Brian, this has been wonderful. Really appreciate your insights and different perspectives here. Lots to think about, folks. This will be available online to watch at your leisure again. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming today. And it's been a real pleasure, everyone. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
All right.
Au revoir.
Thanks,
Take care.
Lloyd.